Well, good morning. We're having the sermon slightly earlier in the service today. We're going to have more time for communion and response afterwards. But as we come to God's Word, do have Genesis 20 open in front of you. If you're using a church Bible, it's page 20. I wonder how long it is before that stops working. Chapter 20, page 20. It's working so far. Genesis chapter 20. And I wonder, as we read the chapter this morning, if anybody else was having a sense of déjà vu. As Susie has already mentioned, a few of us, I think, may have done. If you were around on I think it was the 10th of September, Will was speaking from Genesis chapter 12. And if you were here, this may sound weirdly and tragically familiar. Because in the second half of Genesis 12, Abraham was traveling and was afraid of what, in that case, Pharaoh might do to him. And so he told Sarah to say that she was his sister, and she got taken into Pharaoh's household, but God intervened and protected Sarah, and Abraham was shown to have been deceitful and faithless. Sounds familiar, huh? So I did think this morning I could refer you to Will's preach on YouTube and just sit down, but I won't, because of course there is more to learn as we track with this journey of Abraham, this faith journey that he is on. There are things we can learn, even as, maybe even especially as, he makes the same mistake again. So let's get into it. We're going to look at this story initially in 4 acts, and then we're going to think about 3 ways that we can apply this to our lives. So first, the story. We're going to see, Act 1, how Abraham's faith falters. Then we're going to see how God overrules for good. Act 3, Abimelech challenges Abraham. And then Act 4, Abraham brings blessing. Abraham brings God's blessing to bear. So that's where we're going. We'll look first then at Abraham's faith faltering in verses 1 and 2. Because here's what's happening. We've moved on from all that's been going on with Lot and his family, and we find that Abraham is on this journey again. This journey that he'd been called to when God said, I want you to leave this place and I want you to go to a land that I will show you. And he gave him promises of people and blessing and land. Most recently, as we've been reminded, he's been told that this promise now of a son is just a year away, so that Sarah will have a child, will have a son this time next year, through whom God will bless the world. And that promise is hanging over Abraham and Sarah's lives as the household heads into the Negev desert and ends up near this place called Gerar, a place where Canaan meets Egypt. It seems to have been a trading place. People passed through there all the time, and they come across Abimelech, a king, a leader, a man of some importance and wealth. And Abraham himself, of course, is by this time a powerful tribal leader. He's got a large household. He's got lots of flocks and herds, hence the issue with his servants and Lot's servants back in chapter 13. Realistically, Abraham was not now going to pass through anywhere unnoticed. He would roll into town. He's a powerful man. He would be noticed, and he's worried as he comes in about what interactions there will be and what the expectations are, what expectations there will be. So Joyce Baldwin, who's a commentator on the book of Genesis, she writes that in that culture, such families entered into solemn agreements, promising mutual support, often cementing such treaties by intermarriage. But Abraham was at a disadvantage in this respect, having no daughters. Now, culturally, that jars with us, doesn't it? But that was the culture of the ancient Near East. And something like that may have been in Abraham's mind as he fears he's going to be killed so they can take his wife. So he thinks maybe they can make an alliance. So Abraham says, she's my sister. Again. Just like he did in chapter 12, because it worked out so well last time. Let's do it again. Some skeptics, as they write about this, they think the whole thing must just be a repeat of chapter 12 and not really genuine, because they say a man does not repeat a lapse like this. To which thoughtful people might say, really? Have you studied human nature? Have you looked into your own heart? Is it really so hard to believe that a person might fall into the same sin and the same trap the same default response to a situation? Abraham really does seem to have had a struggle with fear. Possibly that's why when God reiterated the promise to him in chapter 15, it was originally given in chapter 12, and when in chapter 15 he gives it again, he starts by saying, "Do not be afraid, I am your shield." He does seem to have been quite obsessed by the idea that someone might want to kill him to marry Sarah. Now remember, she is officially past childbearing age. God's promise says otherwise, but she is officially past childbearing age, and so, as Joyce Baldwin says, it's probably more likely to have been about political power alliances than expanding the family at this point. But driven by fear, Abraham emphasizes the brother-sister relationship, which again, culturally, is kind of odd to us, isn't it? He comments on that in verse 12, where he says, it's kind of true, we're half-brother, half-sister. You know, it was a different world. Smaller population, perhaps with a gene pool that was suffering less from dangerous mutations, I don't know, but it was more normal in that time. And so he emphasizes their half-brother, half-sister relationship rather than their married status. But let's be honest, there's no denying it was intended to deceive people into thinking that she was not his wife. And it seems to have been a bit of a regular pattern. Again, he says later in verse 13, something that he routinely did. And with no kids running around, it was probably quite plausible too. But it demonstrated a lack of confidence in God's promises, and so once again, Abraham's faith falters. Sarah is taken for the second time. And we come to Act 2 then, in verses 3 to 7. God overrules for good. Because verse 3 starts, but God came to Abimelech. God intervenes here. Firstly, to protect Sarah, because clearly a huge part of Abraham's failure here is cowardice in failing to protect his wife. He's driven by fear for his personal safety rather than concern for her. He puts her at considerable risk. But it's not just his wife who's endangered by this. There's also the plan and promises for the whole world. Because the bigger story behind this story is the account of all that God is doing as he comes to our lost and broken and confused world, and he plans to build a nation through this man and this woman, so that through that nation one will then come who will live and die and rise, the hero, the rescuer, the Christ, to reunite humanity with God. And so God is at work as he calls Abraham and gives these promises. And so as Abraham puts Sarah in harm's way, he endangers not only her, but also the hope of the world. Not to put too fine a point on it, the fatherhood of Sarah's child would now be under a cloud. He's jeopardizing the paternity of their promised son, right on the brink of Isaac's birth story, which comes in the next chapter. Spoiler alert there. But all of that potentially traded away for personal safety. So God intervenes. He comes in a dream to Abimelech. He says, you're as good as dead. You've taken another man's wife. Abimelech rightly says, well, I didn't know. But it's still true that he has taken another man's wife. And while he hasn't slept with her because God stopped him from doing that, society around wouldn't know that. And so he's got to unpick this quickly. This is a huge embarrassment. This dream leaves Abimelech in no doubt. He needs to sort this out, and he needs to go to Abraham, both as the one who God says will pray for him and his household, and to sort out this misunderstanding publicly. So God steps in to stop Abraham's foolish actions messing up a lot of people's lives, and then you get to Act 3, in verses 8 to 13, where Abimelech challenges Abraham. Off the back of the dream, he springs into action. First thing in the morning, basically, he calls a hearing, a kind of a court to be able to bring the challenge and to hear Abraham's reply with witnesses present. Because his situation is this: Abraham's to blame, yes, because he's deliberately deceived, but Abimelech is technically in the wrong as well. And so he needs to make that right, and he needs to publicly vindicate Sarah so that her reputation will be untarnished. So he challenges him in verse 9. What have you done to us? How have I wronged you? This should never be done. And in verse 11, Abraham gives some of his reasons, some of which we've already mentioned, and doesn't really cover himself in glory even now, does he? He's made a judgment that the people of that place had no fear of God and would just kill him, which was not true. And actually, if anything, it looks like it was Abraham who was the one who was not fearing God. He's controlled by fear. He's given the brother-sister line, intending to deceive. You've got a pattern of distorted facts, distorted priorities, and distorted values. And possibly even a bit of a Garden of Eden-like attempt to blame shift in verse 13, as he says, when God caused me to wander from my father's household. This is what I had to do. He basically got me into this situation. In all of this, Abraham's faltering faith is laid bare before them. And then you come to Act 4, in verses 14 to 18, where Abraham brings God's blessing. And resolution is achieved, and actually Abraham is restored. Abimelech brings these gifts. He's showing respect for Abraham, whose intercessions he needed. Abimelech then specifically addresses Sarah. You see that? In verse 16, he honors her and declares her innocent. He tells her that he has given Abraham, who he rather pointedly calls your brother, 1,000 shekels of silver to make plain his own guilt, to make plain his apology, and make it plain that Sarah is vindicated publicly before that gathered court. So then Abraham the prophet steps back into the role that he should have been in all along, restored as a man of faith and bringing blessing to that household. And he prays, and God answers. Their lives are spared, and the barrenness that had struck that household is removed. It's worth noticing here the irony, by the way, that Abraham has no doubt been praying for his wife's fertility for years, with no result to date, but here prays for Abimelech's household and sees an immediate response. And that's hard, isn't it? Perhaps a little reminder of an important but uncomfortable fact that many times issues regarding unanswered prayer are not so much about God's ability to answer, but his timing. Because you remember in chapter 18, in 14 and 15, the question was put, is anything too hard for the Lord? To which the answer was no, but then the Lord said, the son will come at the appointed time. It wasn't the appointed time yet. So in terms of Abraham's prayer for his own wife's fertility, it was simply that the appointed time had not yet come. But through this prayer for Abimelech's household, God answers, and Abraham is back in his role of bringing blessing to the nations. God doesn't reject him. He doesn't say, I'm ditching you, I'm going to find somebody else to represent me now. You're having a laugh if you think that I'll listen to your prayers now. No. What we see is God restoring him and invites him back to fulfill that role once again of bringing blessing to the nations. So it's quite an eventful account, isn't it? But it's important for us because this isn't just historical information of a segment of life in the Bronze Age. All right? That's not what this is. I mean, it is that, but it's more than that, because this is Spirit-inspired, the Spirit-inspired Word of God. So it speaks beyond time and circumstance to people in every age. To God's people in every place. It tells us something of where we come from. It tells us something of our spiritual heritage. And it has application for us as we walk this same walk of faith, as we are part of Abraham's faith family. So what do we take away from this? How do we apply this to our stories? Well, three things we're going to see. The first one is this, that sometimes faith does falter, but it's not the end of the story. Sometimes faith does falter, but it's not the end of the story. What does it mean to be a person of faith in Christ? Mark Twain has a novel called Pudd'nhead Wilson, and in it he refers to a schoolboy's observation that faith is believing what you know ain't so. And I think sometimes we can maybe, well, people say that, don't they? Or they think that faith is somehow willing up the belief in something that maybe you think isn't really true. Wishful thinking, basically. But that's not faith. According to Hebrews 11, verse 1, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. And it's this idea that faith is like a way of perceiving spiritual realities. It's not a blind leap in the dark. Christian faith is actually evidence-based in that it's about trusting the reliable promises of the most reliable person in the world. But it is true that it is about stepping forward with hope and assurance on things that we do not yet see. It's like guided, like in Susie's talk earlier. So I like an expression that Philip Yancey uses where he talks about faith is believing in advance what will only make sense in reverse. And I think there's something to that. It will only fully make sense. We will only fully have sight at the end. But we go forward now with confidence in God's promises. And Hebrews 11 goes on to say in verse 2 that this is what the ancients were commended for. The ancients, including who? Abraham, who features quite heavily in Hebrews 11. Gets a number of mentions. And I think that's one of the tensions for us, isn't it, as we go through this series on the life of Abraham, because we know how the New Testament holds Abraham up as this great example and pioneer of faith. And then we read this up and down journey in Genesis, and we wonder, how do those two things fit together? You know, did the New Testament writers not read Genesis? I think we can be fairly confident that they probably read it and knew it better than we did, actually. Because the truth is, there were highs in Abraham's life, yes. But the life of faith does include times of faltering, but it keeps on going. It keeps on going. It perseveres. It's a journey. It's a struggle. And there are times we fail. And there are times where we contradict what we say we believe by our actions, if not our words. It's not the end of the story, though. We get up and we carry on. And it's important to know this, that this is true, and remember it, whether you've been a follower of Jesus for 5 days or 50 years. You know, if you're a new Christian, if you're a young Christian maybe, you need to hear this. Because in all the joy and enthusiasm of starting out following Jesus and maybe getting baptized and nailing your colours to the mast, it can come as a terrible shock when at some point you falter and mess up. And you think, what just happened? How could I do that? And maybe like a friend of mine from my teenage years, we think, I can't keep this up, and give up. And this friend, it wasn't that he believed that it was untrue. He just thought, I can't keep this up. It was tragic. But listen, you will make mistakes sometimes. Faith will falter sometimes, but it's not the end of the story. It's not just new Christians, though, that need to hear it, is it? Those of us who've been Christians for decades need to hear this too. Because we might falter and think, how could I? You know, I should know better by now. Maybe I think I'm in leadership, or I teach the youth or the kids, or I volunteer for this or that ministry. I'm a fraud. And maybe the fact that you've been a Christian for so long maybe makes it even harder to admit to anybody. One friend of mine who's a pastor in the church that I sometimes meet with to pray, he said a few years ago about an issue that he was struggling with, he just said, I'm so disappointed. I thought I'd dealt with that. I thought I'd got past that. And maybe you feel that even now you might find yourself entangled in something that you'd previously repented of, and you're doing it again. But don't give up. Sort it out, but don't give up. This is not the end of the story. It's important to know this, whether we're new Christians, whether we've been Christians for years. It's actually important to know even if you're not yet a Christian. Maybe as you come here and you sit and you listen and you think about, would I follow Jesus? Am I ready to commit? You wonder, would I be good enough? Could I keep it up? But please understand, that's the whole thing. We don't wait until we feel sorted out to come to Jesus. Coming to Jesus is the sorting out process. He sorts us out. He forgives and heals and starts to remake us. But it's a process. And you will still make mistakes this side of heaven. Come to him. Come as you are. That's all we can do. And let him begin to work on us. Now, we don't want to falter, and that's part of their journey too, isn't it? Learning to grow. Perhaps one of the important things that we all need is what you could call a kind of spiritual self-awareness, so that we know the areas where we're vulnerable, whether it's issues of self-reliance and fear like Abraham, or whatever it might be, having a self-awareness as to where we're prone to falter. And that's going to be helpful for us to know that and to be aware of that. It seems that the question that I think often comes for Abraham and us in how our declared beliefs in God kind of trickle down to everyday life. Because faith needs to do that, doesn't it? It needs to get down to where the rubber hits the road. Because Abraham believed that God would give him a son, but in the cut and thrust of a situation when some real or imagined threat came and he was worried about the safety of him and his wife, he just went to pieces. You know, I can say that I believe God is king over my life and that has my good at heart and that he is sovereign over all things. But when I'm stuck in traffic, or something's gone wrong in my day, or I'm not getting my own way, the day is not turning out how I'd planned, does what I believe really trickle down into those details? Because that's where life's lived, isn't it? In the details. And that's where the issues and the responses often show up for us. Abraham believed that God would give him a son, but somehow in the details of life, he struggled to believe that God could keep him safe and protect his wife and fulfill what he'd promised, which all led to fear and self-dependence and deceit. Sometimes faith does falter, but it's not the end of the story, because here is what's important. Number 2, God is always faithful, even when we are not. And that's what makes the whole thing work. Because God is faithful, 100% reliable in what he says. That's where we get our stability from. That's why it's not the end of the story, because our stories are part of his story, and his story is relentlessly moving forward. And as it does so, we find that he works through us, and it all depends on him, not us. So God's working through Abraham as his channel of blessing to the world, and he keeps on doing that. God shows up here in this story, despite all the carelessness or indifference or fear or just even outright defiance of Abraham. God protects Sarah, he protects the line of Abraham, and he brings him through it. His plan isn't going to be derailed. God doesn't think, oh my goodness, what am I ever going to do now that my people have messed up? No, because the truth is, God is big enough that his plan to bless the world will work even despite, sometimes through, the failures of his people. He is that powerful, and he leads us through. We believe that the Christian life is a guided life, don't we? As it was for Abraham and is for you and me too. God is involved here. He's not passive, he's active and completely faithful. Seen chiefly, ultimately, in giving us Jesus, the one who would eventually come from Abraham, who lived the perfectly faithful life and in whose life we now find our life. That's what gives us confidence to walk in these paths then that he has for us. And it's not to say that failures don't matter. We've got to be clear about that. You know, this isn't a free pass to say, it doesn't really matter, does it? God forgives us, that's his job. That's not what this is. God's given us Christ, who stands with us and for us and empowers us through his Spirit so that we can live a faithful life too in him. So we lift our heads. You know, we get up again if we've fallen down. Rico Tice, the writer of Christianity Explored course, refers to himself as being really good at getting up off the mat, which sometimes is what we've got to do, isn't it? Just get up, lift our heads again. There is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. You're his son, you're his daughter, you're declared righteous. Christ's faithful life made over to your account, and we live out of that place. So God is faithful, even when we are not. But then here's a final thing to reflect on very practically, and that is that we need to encourage one another as we take this faith journey together. I became a follower of Jesus 40 years ago this past summer, chiefly through a Liverpool City Mission children's camp in Dyserth in North Wales. And one of the things that made a big impression on me was at that camp, one of the leaders was telling the story night by night using a little kind of wind-on film strip, if anyone kind of remembers those things, telling the story of Pilgrim's Progress. And I was reading through some of it again recently in the kind of old English unabridged version this time. But in that story, the main character is on a journey from the city of destruction to the cross, where various things happen on the way, and his heavy burden then is rolled away. But then it talks a lot about the ongoing journey to the celestial city. And on that journey, he faces all kinds of things. It's not all sorted once he's come to the cross and had the burden rolled away. It carries on. There's battles. There's Castle Doubting and the giant Despair who lives there. There's all kinds of characters and distractions and dark valleys. But he keeps on going, in part as he is helped by two friends in particular called Faithful and Hopeful, who get alongside him and who walk through the struggles with him and travel together. And I'm struck by that. As we think about the reality of faltering faith, it's important to remember that we are not alone. The Christian life is not a solitary pursuit. It's a team sport. We do this together. That's why we're here. We're on this journey together, and we need one another. You see, you look around this room, and I don't know what you see, but some of you will think that everybody else has pretty much got it together all the time, and they would never have much of a problem with faltering faith. But let me tell you, that's not true. Church is not a showcase for perfect people. It's a community of people who are growing together in Jesus, but who still falter sometimes as they walk the walk of faith. And it's not always obvious, because we don't always introduce ourselves generally by our failings, don't we? We don't say, "Hi, I'm Anthony, and I'm quite annoying sometimes," you know? Or, "I'm Anthony, I've got a bad temper." Or, "My name's so-and-so, and I have a really great line in passive-aggressive behavior." You know, we don't talk like that. Now, as we grow as a community of faith, of course, we don't want to be known primarily for that stuff. What should shine out is something of the love and beauty of Jesus and his grace and his freedom and his joy, and I think that does, actually. But part of that love and grace shining out will include the need to bear with one another and to forgive one another and be patient with one another. Because you know the old expression, "Be patient with me, but because God's not finished with me yet." It's true for our relationships together. Maybe you've heard of Ruth Bell Graham. She was a legend. She died a few years ago. Her husband was Billy Graham, the evangelist. But Ruth, who lived a great life in many ways, she wanted these words on her epitaph. Her epitaph simply says, "Construction complete. Thank you for your patience." I think that's brilliant. Construction complete. Thank you for your patience. The same could be said of Abraham and of all those who've lived the life of faith before us and passed on. We're under construction. Faith falters sometimes. Sometimes our sense of what matters most in the cut and thrust of life gets knocked off course. Like Abraham, we might be paralyzed by fear or weariness or something else. But brothers and sisters, let's hang in there and help one another. Be patient with one another, encouraging one another and helping each other so that our faith will not ultimately falter. And when it does falter, it need not be the end of the story. Let's encourage one another with that to know that God is faithful. So let's reflect. Let's take stock. And as we come to the Lord's table, let's confess where we need to, ask for his help where we need to, and take this opportunity to celebrate God's faithfulness as we express our togetherness as we come and take the bread and the cup. And we come whether we're full of faith and full of joy, just firing on all cylinders, or whether our faith is faltering right now. Maybe especially if our faith is faltering right now, we come. We come knowing God is faithful, that Jesus is with us and for us as we feed on him in our hearts through faith.